give them a hand. Our panelists are coming out. Please have a seat. Excellent. So what we're going to do first, I'd like to have them just give really quick self-introductions, and then we'll get into the topic. We have 30 minutes, so we want to get into this. So Zaya, do you want to just quickly introduce yourself?
Sure. Hi, everyone. My name is Zaya Kadyrova. I work for European Bank of Reconstruction and Development's venture capital arm. So it's a dedicated 100 million fund which invests across Central and Eastern Europe, former Soviet Union, parts of MENA, as well as Greece and Turkey. So we typically invest between 1 and 10 million of euros, equity check size, typically in Series A or later stages, in technology companies, so early stage technology companies. We have about 12 companies in our portfolio, including 2 in Turkey. One of them is called Onedio. The other one is called Trendyol. Both very successful startups here. You probably know about them. So I guess my perspective would be very much from outside of the Silicon Valley, as an investor who invests actively in Europe, Central Eastern Europe, and emerging economies.
This is actually working out well. We have the Silicon Valley representation in the middle, so you're this will be interesting. So Andy, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure, Bill. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Andy Tsao. I'm a managing director with Silicon Valley Bank. For those of you who don't know us, we are the leading bank in the US that focuses exclusively on the tech and innovation ecosystem. We bank more than 50% of the venture-backed technology companies in the US. And I lead a team that we call our Global Gateway, and that's a group that's looking at new technology hubs that are coming up in the world where we don't have physical brick-and-mortar presence. And Turkey has been on that list for the last few years. So this is my 3rd Startup Istanbul. It's great to be back. And my 5th trip to Turkey. And Istanbul is such a magical city, really. The food is amazing. I've had great fish and kebabs, of course. And we are, of course, love Turkish entrepreneurs. We think this ecosystem is really, really interesting, and we've already seen some great progress, so it's good to be back.
Well, actually, the next panel is on fish and kebabs, so we'll get to those just in a moment. So, Eamonn, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, hi, my name's Eamonn Carey. I'm a managing director at Techstars. So Techstars is a global ecosystem that helps entrepreneurs succeed. We run everything from startup weekends in 160 countries around the world to Techstars accelerators now, I think about 33 or 34 programs everywhere from LA to New York to London to Dubai to Adelaide. Vertical focused and horizontally focused programs. We've invested in over 1,500 companies around the world. So I ran a program most recently in New York, have been investing in London for a long time, and I'm also a venture partner at a fund called Zeroth in Hong Kong, which invests in artificial intelligence and machine learning companies. So I've been spending a little bit of time in Japan, Hong Kong, and the kind of Asian region relatively recently, getting to know the ecosystem there and investing in that market. So hopefully have some interesting perspectives from there as well.
Excellent. So we're in for a good ride here. So our thesis here is the circle of greed, the rise and fall of Silicon Valley. So I think we probably ought to test that thesis a little bit, and then we get a little bit into the weeds in various areas. So let's go to the middle first, the Silicon Valley representation for sure. But from the inside perspective, Andy, what do you see some change going on in Silicon Valley, some systemic change that where you might see some chinks in the armor?
Well, certainly the Silicon Valley is not perfect, but I think the title of our panel is a little bit provocative.
It's provocative, yeah.
And I guess as the one resident of Silicon Valley, I guess I would answer that by saying Google, Facebook, Apple, Uber, Airbnb. I think say no more, right? But
Mark Twain had a saying about that, right? The news of my death has
been greatly exaggerated.
Exactly, sure, yeah.
Absolutely. So I still think the Silicon Valley, being perhaps the most mature innovation ecosystem in the world, and given its size and breadth and depth, that there's really not a better place to grow or scale a global business. That being said, it's not without its challenges. For example, the cost of living in the Silicon Valley is extremely high. The cost of engineers, the cost of running a startup, the turnover in staff, these are all systemic issues that we have in the Silicon Valley. And because of all the money chasing deals, it's also, from a valuation perspective, so it depends on which side of the equation you're sitting on, but also probably the highest valuation you're going to pay as an investor in the Silicon Valley as well. So I'll stop there. There's certainly other places we can go.
Let's go to Zaya. So what are your thoughts about our sort of thesis? Is it sort of on track with you know, your thinking?
I mean, I agree that the topic sounds a bit controversial, but I would argue that today you don't need to be based in the Silicon Valley to become a truly global business. And I think the numbers speak for themselves. If we look at Europe, for example, Europe alone has already produced 50 unicorns, and not all of them, you know, most of them are global businesses, but also a lot of them are, you know, European-facing businesses that, you know, manage to become, you know, valued over $1 billion. So I think now you see there's a lot of lessons to be learned, and I think we're going to talk about this, you know, from the Silicon Valley entrepreneurs, as well as, you know, how the businesses scale fast and how they grow fast. But I think the benefits and this is probably something that helped European companies to become unicorns, is the fact that from day one, they had to think globally. I think sort of the model of the Silicon Valley was, you know, you start in the US and you are immediately from day one in a, you know, geographically homogeneous market where everyone speaks English. It's the same labor laws that you're facing. So you're immediately tapping into a large market where you can prove your model really fast. There's a lot of capital available, and then you think globally. Then, you know, first you become successful in the US like Uber, and then you go outside of the United States. For a lot of countries in Europe and the rest of the world, I suppose, you know, the markets are not as big as the United States, so they immediately need to think, how do I at least build a business for the European market? So in Europe, it's 28 countries, 28 languages, so the entrepreneurs are forced to think globally immediately. And I think this is something that's helped businesses grow the way they have, and I think the numbers continue to show that there's a lot of success stories coming out of Europe, not just Silicon Valley.
Sure, absolutely. And Eamonn, you're looking at this, you know, many perspectives. You've been in the U.S., certainly in Europe, and certainly in Asia. How do you view this sort of thought about Silicon Valley's sort of place in the hierarchy?
I mean, I think it's a great place to scale a company. You know, I mean, I think to start a company nowadays, you can pretty much do it anywhere, right? I mean, I think 5 or 10 years ago, if we were having this conversation, you'd see like US companies and the quality of companies coming out would be pretty high. There'd be kind of a bit of a step change in quality to companies in Europe, and a bit of a step change in quality again below to companies in the rest of the world. And now actually that's equalized. And, you know, whether it's WhatsApp or Skype or, you know, Product Hunt or Hacker News or any of these communities, like, people can get access to the same information anywhere in the world nowadays. You can all go and do, you know, Andrew Ng's Coursera course on artificial intelligence. You don't literally have to go to the place that he is in delivering it. So I think great businesses can start anywhere. The interesting question comes where you can scale. So, you know, I think the Valley's place is going to be cemented for a long time to come. Not least, you know, to Andy's point, all of those big companies are there. It is still the hub for most M&A. You know, I mean, you still see some M&A activity happening in Europe, Middle East, Africa, Asia, but by far and away, you know, the highest prices that people are willing to pay for companies, which drives the liquidity to grow future companies, still comes in Silicon Valley. So I think from that perspective, it will continue to be a mainstay and a great place. Is it the only place? Absolutely not anymore. I mean, you look, you know, Baidu, Alibaba, Tencent, you know, you look at TransferWise, you look at all of these kind of companies coming out of Asia and Europe, and, you know, they're scaling. They maybe have an engineering office or a sales office in San Francisco to keep their VCs happy, but for a variety of reasons, including cost base, you know, their R&D stuff will be happening in Tallinn, or, you know, will be happening in Ukraine, or will be happening in, you know, Vietnam or India or any of these markets. So, you know, I think Silicon Valley will always have its place. I wish people would stop putting the word silicon in front of whatever their ecosystem is. It's like Bean Girls. It's like, stop trying to make it. It's not going to happen. So, you know, I think people should just understand what their ecosystem is good at, build it from there, and, not necessarily look over your shoulder and worry too much.
Right.
The greed part of Silicon Valley, maybe that's a different conversation.
Sure.
I heard Silicon Beach here last time. Is that being used at all, or is there
Turkey?
one for Istanbul? Silicon blank?
I haven't
No,
seen it, but
okay.
so, Andy, I think we can go in a few different directions, but the one thing that I think would be really good to talk about now would be to really identify sort of the core assets that really advantage companies in Silicon Valley. So what are, when you think of the things and let's put capital, I think capital is sort of an automatic, but what else in that ecosystem really is particularly catalyzing for new
Right.
ventures?
Well, I think Eamonn put his finger on a few of the things that really make the Silicon Valley kind of a special place. I mean, to your point, I mean, you can't not mention the capital, right? So it's still, it's by a factor of probably 3 versus the next biggest market in the U.S., which I think is New York right now. So there's just so much capital available, not only from VCs, of course. You're also talking about angels, and the whole virtuous cycle has happened so often in the Silicon Valley that when people come into liquidity, they get back into investing in technology companies. And so when you say what are some of the assets, it's all that accumulated experience that keeps really applying to this virtuous cycle. And on top of that, given in part it's just the status that Silicon Valley has achieved in the world as a leading technology hub, we were saying before, the talent is really fungible, right? And people can choose to travel wherever they want to launch a business. Well, Silicon Valley has the advantage by reputation that people, the best and brightest from around the world, will go to Silicon Valley to become investors, to become entrepreneurs. I'm sure you guys probably know, but it's roughly 43% of the founders in Silicon Valley come from somewhere else. Yeah. It's a very international place with some of the best and the brightest. And those are kind of some of the things that give the Silicon Valley such an advantage over other technology hubs. But I know it's my role to some degree to defend the Silicon Valley, but I do agree with this notion that as technology is globalizing very, very quickly, and that you certainly do not have to be in Silicon Valley to successfully launch a business today.
So just a quick follow-up question,
Yeah.
so we just kind of get to a point. So, the thought that, I guess you sort of started with the capital, but it seems like capital is more intelligent, right? Capital is very mobile as well, right? So if there must be significant assets that are there and resources that are causing sort of this natural, really very natural phenomenon now that are, I mean, again, the capital would move if that wasn't there. So, it sounds like network, the sort of core competencies of education and highly qualified workforce and so on. I guess, are there some, 2, 3, 4 things that you think are just the center of causing that capital to remain there?
Right. Yeah, I mean, for one thing, big tech is certainly there in the Bay Area. So if you are an entrepreneur where you need to leverage big tech, whether it's through partnerships or distribution, et cetera, there's no better place in terms of accessing those kind of partners. As far as research universities, it was an interesting study that we did a few years ago as we tracked entrepreneurs in our early stage practice, those that went from seed funding to successfully raising Series A, and we're tracking a number of different attributes, and it turned out that in 75% of the cases, 4 universities turned up in the founding teams, and 2 of those were Stanford and Cal Berkeley, so very, very influential universities in terms of innovation and its impact on innovation. Anybody want to guess on the other 2? They're East Coast-based schools, by the way.
Well, one starts with an H.
You're right. One starts with H, Harvard.
And the other starts with an M?
You got it. You guys are good. So certainly education, and then, Bill, I'd say, experienced investors, management talent. I mean, it really, service providers that all they do day in and day out is focus on successfully launching startups and working with scaling technology companies. It's all those things that in accumulation that make it really a special place.
The perfect storm, as it were.
And on top of that, you have great weather.
You have great weather. Yeah, there is that for sure. So Zaya, where else, I guess as you travel around and you get into all these other wonderful ecosystems, where else do you see now sort of as being most competitive with these assets and resources that are available in Silicon Valley? Where are some of the other centers that are really strong?
I mean, the great thing is that there's, centers emerging all over the place.
Yeah.
I think probably the one that comes, it's still far, it's a far second, but still comes, comparably close is London, the United Kingdom. And there's various reasons for that. I think the universities, as you mentioned, there's some really, really strong universities that produce a lot of innovative ideas around artificial intelligence, deep tech, and this is something that the UK has benefited from significantly. The United Kingdom also has a large pool of capital, venture capital, government funding, government programs, et cetera, which helped develop this ecosystem, as well as the people. So the people is a very important element, and London, up until, well, at least for the time being, attracts a lot of foreign talent and a lot of people working, a lot of tech talent that comes from the rest of Europe or the rest of the world. And this is something, again, that helped develop the ecosystem. Otherwise, I mean, I see sort of ecosystems developing in the Middle East. There's, at least in its budding stages in Dubai. There's the rest of Europe, places like Berlin. There's Barcelona. There's Amsterdam. So you sort of see, various smaller ecosystems naturally developing. And I think sort of capital, it's either capital coming first or capital following that. I think each one of them started a bit differently. In the Middle East, I would argue, it was capital first, and then sort of the rest of it followed. In Europe, in a lot of places, it started out with universities, the people, and then sort of the money followed them. But yeah, the great thing is that it's sort of everywhere. And then I guess in Asia, probably I'm less familiar with the Southeast Asian.
That's a good segue. It's wonderful. I can leave. This is perfect. Eamonn, what are your thoughts in terms of where besides Silicon Valley is really?
Well, I think it's interesting looking at kind of vertical specific ecosystems. So London is one of the best places in the world to start a fintech company. If you're going to start something in property tech or smart cities, maybe Dubai is one of the best places in the world to start a company that's like that. I think if you look into kind of Asian markets, there's a lot of capital in Singapore. There's an increasing number of investors in Hong Kong. Obviously China and India are two just huge behemoths on their own. Difficult markets for people outside those markets to start in, but to scale in if you get the right partnerships, it's certainly super interesting. But I mean, certainly Singapore is doing a big push to kind of become regulatory or a friendly environment from a regulatory perspective, whether it's for health or fintech or anything else. There's some incredible companies coming out of Jakarta in Indonesia. You've got some incredible companies coming out of Thailand. So, there are lots and lots of different ecosystems springing up all over the place. I think the interesting thing is to watch what comes first. Is it the vertical? Is it the available business that's there? Or is it just, a bunch of money suddenly becomes available and everyone follows after that? Because if it's a bunch of money becoming available, sometimes it doesn't work out quite so well.
Right, you don't have the support infrastructure that makes it good money.
I think the Valley thing is there's a density of quality in the Valley that you don't have anywhere else, right? I mean, I don't know how many people here have ever gone to a dinner party in San Francisco?
Anyone?
Right, but, I mean, if you go to one, you very rarely talk about the weather or anything that's not tech related. Pretty much everyone that you meet there is involved in some way, shape, or form. They're a founder, they want to be a founder, they're a product manager somewhere, they're a consultant, they're an investor, or sometimes they're all of those things at once. And so there are very few other ecosystems in the world where that exists. I mean, when I started my first company in Ireland, I think I was saying to you guys earlier, you would go and someone would say, I'll help you and I'll make this introduction, but I want 5% of your company. or I want 2,000 euros a month in order to help you out.
That sounds like greed.
Yeah, that is greed, right? And what you get when you go to the Valley, or you go to New York, or you go to London now, or you go to kind of a lot of these, the slightly bigger ecosystems, is people will help one another, right? That kind of collaborative environment that existed for a very, very long time in the Valley and in the Bay Area is now starting to trickle out into other environments, but it's just so huge in the Bay Area at the moment and in the Valley that, that gives it a significant kind of leg up. So it's good to watch all of those things develop. Like you go now to city.ai meetings, or we go to, startup weekend events, and, everyone is communicating and collaborating a little bit more. And that's even starting to happen in the VC world. Like I run an email for VCs with just interesting companies I've met from around the world. 70%, there's about 300 people signed up for it. 70% of them are in the Valley because they want to deploy capital elsewhere now. So, I think everyone recognizes there are emerging ecosystems. It's now just a matter of tapping into them.
Yeah. So staying with you for just a moment, we talked a little bit about capital, and Tim Draper talked about ICOs and the Bitcoins and so on. How do you see that affecting where people can go to
Number
be
one
successful?
investor question, at the moment is like, does ICO, does this ICO landscape mean that, VCs are dead? And I'm sure there are a bunch of investors or entrepreneurs in the room who've had bad experiences with VCs who are keeping their fingers crossed that we all get kind of washed out to sea and have to, learn to communicate with dolphins. But I think realistically what's going to happen is there's going to be an augmentation, right? I don't know if anyone here has been following the story of Tezos. So Tezos was one of the biggest ICOs. They raised $240 million, which is now worth about $500 million because of the appreciation of Bitcoin and Ethereum since it was raised. But the whole thing has turned into a giant disaster area. Like, there are huge issues around governance. There are class action lawsuits being brought against people. If you look at, I would say 70 or 80% of the ICOs that you see listed at the moment are a scam, are fraudulent, or incompetent, or all of the above. So the governance layer that exists that VCs bring in terms of due diligence and a level of, you guys might think that we're all assholes, but we actually try and bring a level of rigor and quality to the stuff that we do. That doesn't exist in the ICO world yet. And my fear is a lot of people will lose their shirt investing in ICOs and be put off investing for a long time as a result. So actually, I think there's a role, and you can see Spice VC and Blockchain Capital and others are coming in to kind of add that layer of governance, to add that layer of kind of respectability, responsibility, due diligence, and everything else. And what will end up happening is, I think ICOs and VCs will coexist, right? One, it's like AI and humans, right? One will augment the other, and I think that's what has to happen. I'm excited by ICOs. I've invested in a bunch of them. I want a lot of them to do well, and I love the idea of democratizing access to funding for startups and also democratizing access to investing for lots of people. But the accredited investor rules in the US exist for a reason. They don't want people to lose their life savings by investing in something that appears to have all of the trappings of normality, but is ultimately just some person looking to line their pockets. So I think there's a little bit of collaborating. Yeah.
Early days. So good, thank you. So what we're going to do is kind of shift a little bit in terms of, we've kind of been talking sort of more generally, and obviously we want you to go out with some actions which will help your venture succeed. So Zaya, as we think about whether it's going to Silicon Valley or any of these sort of more mature, stronger, supportive innovation communities, when you think if you were leading a venture that was getting ready to move in, what are some of the things that you would make sure that you took care of before you got there and prepared sort of set yourself up for the most success?
Sure. Yeah, we have a few companies that we work with that have relocated to the US, and they were very successful at doing that. There's the logistics part that you need to take care of first of all. So typically it's a registration in the US. Because for step 2, which I'm going to mention in a second, for raising money, it would make things a lot easier if you are a US registered company. And typically Delaware or New York is considered to be the more sort of startup friendly type of laws. The United States, every state has its own sort of laws, and you need to be registered in a specific state. It's not just all of the US. So a lot of our companies are Delaware registered. And then I would say step number 2 would be to, if you actually want to be US facing, you need to think about relocating either as a CEO, founder, or, I mean, I think you would have to be the CEO who relocates, or at least one of the core, co-founders or core team members who relocates to the US. You need to establish, presence, opening an office, and then thinking about building out a team. And especially if it's enterprise sales, you need to think about recruiting local sales teams, which is quite a competitive sort of space, and it's challenging. And this is when you need to think about raising money in the US. So we typically say, if you, even us, like as investors in our portfolio companies, for our portfolio companies that want to go to the US, we say, for your next round, we need to make sure that you have a US investor on board. If you want to be in the Valley, we need to go and reach out and fundraise in the Valley, because it helps, opening doors in terms of the presence. And then once you have the money, investing in the right talent and the right teams. And again, building out a sales team is not easy. It's very competitive in the States. It's very expensive. But this is something that you need to do, especially if you're in the enterprise, sales business. So I would say these are the 3 things. It's logistics, money, and human capital.
Yep.
Local
Super.
human capital.
Yeah, so Andy, your thoughts in terms of, as you talk to ventures that are moving into the Valley, what would we add to that list of things that they should prepare?
Well, first of all, that was a great list, particularly for EBRD in London. That I would underscore a lot of the advice you just heard. When it comes to raising funding in the U.S. for the entrepreneurs in the room, the earlier stage you are, you absolutely need to be based in the Bay Area or the U.S. if you're going to be expect to raise funding at an early stage. Obviously, if you're more of a scale-up or growth phase, there are a cadre of investors who will gladly help you scale your business globally. But generally, if you're looking for angel funding, seed funding, you really do have to be local, because the investors expect to interact with you on a very regular basis, and that's hard to do if you're many time zones and thousands of miles away. Beyond that, the advice is out there, right, guys? I mean, the Silicon Valley is perhaps the most competitive market in the world as well. So that means really being prepared if you're going to think about relocating to the Bay Area. Don't turn up, sort of starry-eyed and not being prepared, because obviously you have a great ecosystem here. It's growing, but when you get to the Silicon Valley, you're kind of really swimming with the sharks, because there are so many people that go to the Bay Area to launch their businesses. So being prepared. There's so much information, as you said, Bill, on the internet today, to be able to look at some best practices in terms of entering the U.S. market, in terms of raising funding. Even basic things like your pitch, right? You've got to be able to do your elevator pitch, flawlessly as you begin to build your network in the Silicon Valley.
So I want to segue on that, because we've got, as you can see, we now have time, 1 minute and 20 seconds left. So I want kind of one final thought, and it's going to be very brief from each of you, but what's one thing we can all do, and again, whether we're local or we're looking to sort of go into maybe a larger ecosystem, what's one thing that we can and should do before we get there from a standpoint of building our network? Because I think you were segueing into that notion of sort of leveraging both the people possibly at home and also the people in the relationships to connect with new relationships quickly in the new community. But Eamonn, do you have a thought about one thing, best practice that we could do to make sure that we sort of, from a network standpoint, land with friends?
Yeah, I think be visible is the thing that I would suggest. So if you want to apply to Y Combinator, you should be commenting on Hacker News. If you want to be, in front of lots of people in the Bay Area, you should be commenting and posting stuff on Product Hunt or On Deck Daily. Be visible in these communities. Find the, most successful person from your country or your hometown who is in Silicon Valley and get in touch with them. You would be surprised at how open people will be. But, make yourself visible to folks there and tap up every connection you can.
Cool. All right, Andy, quick.
Yeah, really put yourself out there in terms of, building your network. It's very, very easy in the Bay Area for some of basically the cultural attributes of the Bay Area, as Eamonn was saying, this culture of collaboration. It is very easy to, within a few degrees of separation, to build a pretty valuable network. I've seen too many mistakes by entrepreneurs who come, and even though I would definitely leverage people in your home community that have also come, but there are people that end up just staying within their local communities and not pushing themselves hard enough to build their local network, and that's something you need to do.
Get out of your comfort zone, right? And Zaya, how do you bring us home on this topic?
Yeah, I would argue that as an entrepreneur, you need to first and foremost focus on your business and make sure that you have a kick-ass product. If you have a product that is amazing, everyone will follow you, and all the capital, including the Silicon Valley capital, is going to knock on your doors. Good. So that should be your #1 focus as an entrepreneur.
Cool. Well, please help me thank our panel. Thank you, panel. Awesome job. Thank you all for your attention. I don't think we get some music. This is good. We have the march off music.
Apocalyptic end of the world music.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.